Christmas Eve at Chicago O'Hare Airport. Snow falling heavy. A blonde flight attendant in handcuffs, screaming through the crowded terminal. He's lying. He can't be a pilot. Check his ID again. Police dragging her away while hundreds of passengers filmed. But the real shock wasn't the arrest. It was the true identity of the black man she had just accused. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from tonight. Hit that like button if you believe in standing up for justice, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this one. Now, let me tell you about the phone call that changed everything. Captain Nathaniel Brooks stood 6 feet 1 inch tall, his dark skin gleaming under the fluorescent lights of the crew lounge at Los Angeles International Airport. At 42 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had earned every stripe on his shoulder. His uniform was immaculate, pressed to perfection, the 4 gold bars on his epaulets catching the light as he gathered his belongings. Those 4 bars represented 18 years of dedication, thousands of hours in the sky, and a journey that had taken him from the poorest neighborhoods of Detroit to the cockpit of a commercial airliner. His smile came easy, revealing straight white teeth against his dark complexion. He kept his hair cropped short and neat, military style, a habit he had never been able to break even after all these years as a civilian. His hands were steady, the hands of a surgeon or a pilot, capable of making split-second decisions that meant the difference between life and death. He had made those decisions before, in skies far more dangerous than any commercial route. Nathaniel checked his watch and felt his heart warm. In just a few hours, he would be home. Home with Denise, his wife of 15 years, who was probably already basting the Christmas turkey and humming along to Mariah Carey. Home with Maya, his 8-year-old daughter who had called him 3 times during his layover just to make sure he was really coming home tonight. Home with Jerome Jr., his 5-year-old son who genuinely believed his father was a superhero because he could fly through the clouds. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through the photos Denise had sent. Maya in her red Christmas dress, standing next to the tree they had decorated together before he left. Jerome Jr. in his Spider-Man pajamas, holding up a sign that said, "Welcome home Daddy," in crooked letters. The Christmas tree glittering in the corner of their living room in the suburbs of Chicago. Everything he had worked for, everything he had sacrificed for, was waiting for him in that house. Denise Brooks was 38 years old, a 3rd-grade teacher at Lincoln Elementary who had a gift for making every child feel special. She had met Nathaniel at a church fundraiser 12 years ago, back when he was still wearing his Air Force uniform and she was still wearing the skepticism of a woman who had been hurt before. He had won her over slowly, patiently, the same way he approached everything in life. Now she was his rock, his anchor, the voice on the other end of the phone that reminded him why he kept flying. Nathaniel's career was the stuff of legend among his colleagues, though he never spoke of it himself. He had enlisted in the United States Air Force at 18, desperate to escape the dying factories and empty streets of Detroit. His father had worked the line at an auto plant for 30 years before it closed, leaving the family with nothing but memories and medical bills. Nathaniel had sworn he would find another way, and he had found it in the sky. He had flown F-16 fighter jets over the mountains of Afghanistan, providing close air support for ground troops who counted on him to keep them alive. He had completed 3 combat tours, earning commendations and promotions with each deployment. In 2008, during a mission that would later be classified, he had single-handedly destroyed an enemy ambush position that had pinned down a convoy of 23 American soldiers. The Distinguished Flying Cross that hung in his study at home was his reminder that courage was not the absence of fear but the decision that something else was more important. After leaving the military, Nathaniel had transitioned to commercial aviation with Continental Airways. He had started as a first officer, worked his way up through regional routes, and finally earned his captain's wings 7 years ago. He was one of the first black pilots at Continental to hold that rank, a fact that filled him with equal parts pride and frustration. Pride because he had earned it, frustration because in the year 2023, it was still noteworthy. His record was spotless. 15,200 hours of flight time without a single incident. 3 consecutive Pilot of the Year awards from the airline. A reputation for calm under pressure that had become almost mythical among the flight crews. When weather got bad and passengers got nervous, they wanted Captain Brooks in the cockpit. He had never let them down. The December evening had settled over Los Angeles with unusual chill as Nathaniel completed his pre-flight checks in the crew lounge. Christmas Eve traffic had been brutal, and the weather reports from Chicago were concerning. Heavy snow, possible delays, the kind of conditions that made flying challenging even for experienced pilots. But Nathaniel was not concerned. He had flown through worse over the Hindu Kush mountains with enemy fire lighting up the night sky. He checked his phone one more time before heading to the gate. A text from Denise, "Maya won't sleep. Says Santa can't come until Daddy comes home." He smiled and typed back, "Tell her I'm on my way. Nothing's going to stop me tonight." He gathered his flight bag, tucked his captain's hat under his arm, and headed toward the gate. In his other bag, carefully wrapped and hidden from prying eyes, were the presents he had bought during his layover. A princess doll for Maya, the one she had been begging for since September. A remote control car for Jerome Jr., the expensive one that actually worked. Small tokens of love from a father who missed too many bedtimes and too many school plays. The flight from Los Angeles to Chicago was scheduled for 4 hours. By the time he landed, completed his paperwork, and drove home, it would be close to midnight. But he would make it. He always made it. The passengers filing onto Flight 847 did not know it, but they were in the safest hands in the sky. Captain Nathaniel Brooks was taking them home for Christmas. Brittany Morrison checked her reflection in the window of Gate B-17 at Chicago O'Hare and adjusted her silk scarf with practiced precision. At 28 years old, she had cultivated an image of effortless elegance that she wore like armor. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves past her shoulders, framing a face that had graced the society pages of the Atlanta Journal-Constitution more times than she could count. Her blue eyes, cold as a winter morning, scanned the crowded terminal with barely concealed disdain. She was exhausted, irritated, and increasingly furious. Her shift had ended 2 hours ago, but her connecting flight to Atlanta had been delayed indefinitely due to the snowstorm that was currently blanketing the Midwest. She should have been halfway to her parents' estate in Buckhead by now, sipping champagne and receiving compliments on her new designer handbag. Instead, she was stuck in this fluorescent purgatory, surrounded by screaming children and harried travelers who apparently had never learned the concept of personal space. Her uniform, the navy blue ensemble of Prestige Airlines, still fit her like a glove despite the long day. She took pride in her appearance, always had. Her mother Victoria had drilled that into her since childhood. "Presentation is everything, darling," Victoria would say, adjusting young Brittany's posture before cotillion practice. "People judge you in the first 3 seconds. Make sure they see someone worth knowing." The Morrison family of Atlanta was old money, or at least old enough money that people had stopped asking where it came from. Her father Richard had served 2 terms in the Georgia state legislature before transitioning to the private sector, where his political connections had proven remarkably profitable. He now sat on the board of directors for Morrison Properties, one of the largest real estate development firms in the Southeast. Her mother operated a chain of upscale spas that catered to the wives of men who measured their worth in yacht lengths and vacation home counts. Brittany had grown up in a world of country clubs and charity galas, of horse riding lessons and debutante balls. She had attended the finest private schools, where she learned that there were 2 types of people in the world, those who belonged and those who served. Her parents had never explicitly stated which category certain people fell into, but the implications had been clear enough in their carefully phrased comments and knowing glances. She had chosen to become a flight attendant not out of necessity but out of rebellion. A brief, glamorous rebellion that allowed her to travel the world while still maintaining the lifestyle her family's name afforded her. It was temporary, of course. She was already engaged to Preston Whitmore III, whose family owned half the commercial real estate in Midtown Atlanta. The wedding was scheduled for next spring, a lavish affair that would make the social pages for weeks. But tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Preston had called to inform her that he would be spending Christmas Eve at his ex-girlfriend's party, and when Brittany had objected, he had told her she was being dramatic. The argument had escalated quickly, ending with Preston hanging up and Brittany resisting the urge to throw her phone across the terminal. She needed coffee. She needed a seat. She needed to get out of this godforsaken airport and back to civilization. As she scanned the waiting area for an empty chair, her eyes landed on something that made her stop mid-stride. A black man sat alone near the window, wearing a pilot's uniform. Not just any uniform, but a captain's uniform, complete with the 4 gold stripes that indicated the highest cockpit rank. He was on his phone, video chatting with what appeared to be a young girl, his face softened into a smile that seemed entirely too comfortable for someone in his position. Brittany felt something tighten in her chest. She had worked in aviation for 3 years, and in that time, she had seen exactly 4 black pilots. 4. And none of them had been captains. The man before her was older, maybe early 40s, with the kind of confident posture that suggested he thought he belonged in that uniform. But something about the picture did not add up in her mind. She moved closer, pretending to check the departure board nearby. The man was still on his call, speaking in warm tones to the child on the screen. "I'll be home soon, baby girl. Tell your brother daddy's bringing presents." His voice was deep and educated, without a trace of accent that she could detect. His uniform appeared authentic, the Continental Airways logo clearly visible on his breast pocket. His captain's hat sat on the seat beside him, and his flight bag was at his feet. But still, something nagged at her. Something her father had said once, during one of his rants about affirmative action ruining the country. "They put these people in positions they haven't earned," Richard Morrison had declared over Thanksgiving dinner. "Just to check a box. And someday, it's going to get people killed." Brittany straightened her spine and approached the man. If there was even a chance that this uniform was stolen, that this man was impersonating an airline pilot in a major airport on Christmas Eve, someone needed to say something. Someone needed to be vigilant. She was doing her duty as an aviation professional. The man looked up as she stopped in front of him, his phone call apparently ended. His expression was neutral, professional, the look of someone accustomed to being approached by strangers. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice polite but guarded. Brittany crossed her arms over her chest. "Excuse me," she said, her tone carrying the subtle edge of accusation. "Whose uniform is that?" The man's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained calm. "It's mine, ma'am. I'm a captain with Continental Airways." Something in his assurance struck her as arrogant. "Right," she said, letting skepticism drip from every syllable. "And I'm the Queen of England." The man did not flinch. Instead, he reached into his breast pocket and produced an identification badge, holding it up for her to see. "Captain Nathaniel Brooks," he said evenly. "Employee number 44782. I've just landed from Los Angeles, and I'm heading home to my family." Brittany studied the badge with narrowed eyes. It looked real, but these days, anyone could fake an ID. The photo matched the man's face, but that did not prove anything. "This could be fabricated," she said. "Anyone can make a fake badge." The man, this Nathaniel Brooks, let out a slow breath. Something flickered in his eyes, something that looked almost like exhaustion, as if this was not the first time he had faced such questions. "Ma'am, I've been flying for 18 years. I served in the United States Air Force before that. If you'd like, you can contact the airline directly to verify my credentials." But Brittany was not listening anymore. The exhaustion in his eyes only confirmed her suspicions. A real captain would be outraged at being questioned. This man's resignation suggested guilt, suggested a man who knew he had been caught and was trying to talk his way out of it. "I don't think so," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I think you need to explain why you're wearing that uniform. Where did you get it? Did you steal it?" Around them, heads were beginning to turn. A mother pulled her children closer. A businessman lowered his newspaper to watch. The man's calm was starting to crack, and Brittany felt a surge of vindication. She was right. She was always right about these things. Brittany's voice cut through the ambient noise of the terminal like a knife through silk. She had learned long ago that volume was power, that the person who controlled the narrative controlled the outcome. And right now, she intended to control this situation completely. "Everyone, please be careful," she announced, her arms spread wide as if she were directing traffic. "This man is wearing a stolen pilot uniform. He could be a security threat." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication, and she watched with satisfaction as passengers began to edge away from the seated man. Nathaniel Brooks remained in his chair, his hands resting on his knees in a posture of deliberate non-threat. 18 years of dealing with suspicious glances and whispered comments had taught him the rules of engagement. Stay calm. Stay visible. Do not give them any reason to escalate. He had learned these rules the hard way, from the first time a passenger had demanded to see his credentials before boarding, to the countless occasions when hotel staff had assumed he was the bellhop rather than the guest. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady as bedrock, "I understand your concern, but I assure you I am exactly who I say I am. If you'll allow me to contact my airline." "Oh, I'll contact someone all right," Brittany interrupted, her phone already in her hand. Her manicured fingers flew across the screen as she dialed airport security. "Yes, hello. I need to report a suspicious individual at gate B17. A black male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing what appears to be a stolen pilot uniform. He claims to be a captain, but I have serious doubts about the authenticity of his credentials. This could be a security threat. Please send someone immediately." She emphasized the words, "black male," with particular clarity, ensuring that the description would leave no room for confusion. Around her, the crowd had grown. Some passengers were openly filming with their phones, their cameras capturing every moment of the confrontation. Others had moved to the edges of the waiting area, watching with the morbid fascination of people who sensed they were witnessing something significant. Nathaniel felt the familiar weight settle onto his shoulders, the weight he had carried since childhood. The weight of being presumed guilty until proven innocent, of having to justify his existence in spaces where others moved freely. He thought of his father, who had worked double shifts at the plant only to be passed over for promotion time and again. He thought of his mother, who had always told him to keep his head high and his voice calm. "They want you to lose your temper," she had said. "Don't give them the satisfaction." "Ma'am," he tried again, "I have my employee ID, my flight certification, my driver's license. I can provide whatever documentation you need." "Documentation can be faked," Brittany shot back. "How do I know you didn't kill a pilot and take his uniform? How does anyone here know we're safe with you walking around pretending to be something you're not?" The accusation hung in the air, so absurd that Nathaniel almost laughed. Almost. But he had seen too many situations like this go wrong because someone laughed at the wrong moment. So instead, he simply waited, his hands still visible, his posture still non-threatening, his dignity still intact despite every attempt to strip it away. The security officers arrived within 4 minutes. 2 men in uniforms, their badges gleaming under the terminal lights. Officer Derek Walsh was the first to approach, a 35-year-old white man with a military-style haircut and a kind of swagger that suggested he took his authority very seriously. His partner, Officer Miguel Santos, hung back slightly, his expression carefully neutral. "Sir, we received a report of a suspicious individual," Derek said, his hand resting on his belt near his weapon. "I'm going to need you to stand up slowly and provide identification." Nathaniel rose from his seat with deliberate care, keeping his hands visible at all times. "Of course, officer. I'm Captain Nathaniel Brooks with Continental Airways. I just landed from Los Angeles about an hour ago. My identification is in my breast pocket. May I reach for it?" Derek nodded curtly, and Nathaniel produced his employee badge, his pilot's license, and his driver's license. He handed them over one by one, watching as the officer examined each document with exaggerated scrutiny. "These look legitimate," Miguel said from behind his partner, but Derek silenced him with a glance. "Where did you get this uniform?" Derek asked, his tone suggesting he had already decided on the answer. I've worn this uniform for 11 years, Nathaniel replied. Before that, I wore the uniform of the United States Air Force. I have served my country in ways I am not at liberty to discuss. I have never been arrested, never been accused of any crime, and I would appreciate being treated with the same respect you would afford any other airline captain. Brittany stepped forward, her face flushed with righteous indignation. He's lying. Can't you see he's lying? A real pilot would have already proven himself. Why is he being so defensive? Derek seemed to consider this. Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening. Open your bags, please. The request was not unusual under the circumstances, but the manner in which it was delivered, the public spectacle being made of a routine verification, spoke volumes about the assumptions being made. Nathaniel complied, moving to an open area where his bags could be searched in full view of the growing crowd. He unzipped his flight bag first, revealing charts, manuals, and the detritus of a professional pilot. Then he opened the larger bag, the one containing his personal belongings and the Christmas presents he had so carefully selected. Derek's hands were not gentle as they rifled through the contents. The princess doll emerged first, still in its packaging. Then the remote control car, its box slightly dented from the journey. Finally, a handmade card with the words, "We love you Daddy," written in crayon, Maya's careful letters decorated with hearts and stars. Probably stolen goods, Brittany announced to the crowd. Who knows where he got those? Something in Nathaniel cracked at that moment. Not his composure, which remained as solid as ever. But something deeper, something that had been accumulating over 4 decades of moments exactly like this one. The card from his daughter lay on the airport floor, touched by strangers who had no right to it, displayed for the judgment of people who had already decided he was guilty. A woman nearby pulled her young son closer, whispering something Nathaniel could not hear. An elderly man shook his head in what might have been disgust or might have been sympathy, it was impossible to tell. The cameras kept recording, capturing every moment of his humiliation for posterity. And overhead, the speakers played "Silent Night," the words of peace and goodwill mocking the scene unfolding below. Miguel Santos cleared his throat. Derek, we should verify with the airline. This doesn't feel right. But Derek was not listening. He was enjoying this, Nathaniel realized. Enjoying the power, the spectacle, the chance to be the hero who caught the imposter. Sir, I'm going to need you to remain here until we complete our investigation. Do not attempt to leave the area. Nathaniel looked at his belongings scattered across the floor. Looked at the crowd watching his degradation. Looked at Brittany Morrison's smug, satisfied face. And then he looked at his phone, still in his hand, and thought about a promise he had made to a man whose life he had once saved. Officer, he said quietly, I'm going to make one phone call. After that, you'll have all the proof you need. Now before I continue with what happened next, I need to ask you something. Do you think Nathaniel should have stayed calm through all of that, or would you have lost your temper? Comment number 1 if you believe he showed incredible strength, or comment number 2 if you think you would have reacted differently. And while you're down there, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because what happens next is going to blow your mind. Nathaniel's fingers were steady as he scrolled through his contacts, his heart pounding but his hands betraying nothing. 18 years of crisis training had taught him to compartmentalize, to separate his emotions from his actions when the situation demanded clarity. And this situation demanded absolute clarity. Brittany Morrison let out a theatrical laugh. Oh, this should be good. Calling your lawyer? Let me save you the trouble, whatever bottom feeder you've got on speed dial isn't going to help you now. My father has connections you couldn't dream of. Nathaniel did not respond. His thumb hovered over a contact labeled simply, Admiral Foster, and memories flooded through him like water through a broken dam. Afghanistan, 2008. A convoy pinned down in a valley, RPG fire raining down from the surrounding ridges. 23 soldiers, including a young naval officer who had been attached to the unit as a liaison. Captain Raymond Foster, they had called him then. The man who would not leave his wounded men, even as enemy fighters closed in. Nathaniel had been providing air support from his F-16, circling above the carnage like a guardian angel with weapons hot. The situation was deteriorating by the second. Standard protocol would have been to fall back and wait for ground reinforcements. But there were no reinforcements coming, and the men in that valley would be dead in 15 minutes if someone did not do something unprecedented. What Nathaniel did next would later be described in classified documents as beyond the scope of reasonable risk assessment. He had taken his aircraft down into the valley itself, flying lower than any pilot should fly, using his jet as a weapon of terror against the enemy positions. The roar of his engines had scattered the attackers long enough for the convoy to reach cover. His precision strikes had eliminated the primary threat positions. And when it was over, when the dust settled and the survivors were evacuated, Raymond Foster had gripped his hand with tears streaming down his face and sworn an oath. "I owe you my life, Nate. I owe you the lives of my men. Anything you ever need, for as long as I live, you call me. Anything." Nathaniel had never called in that favor. Not when he faced discrimination during his transition to civilian aviation. Not when he was passed over for promotions that should have been automatic. Not when passengers complained about having a black pilot and demanded reassignment. He had handled every challenge on his own terms, determined to prove that he did not need special treatment to succeed. But tonight was different. Tonight was not about him. Tonight was about every black man who would be accused without evidence, every person of color who would be humiliated in public for the crime of existing in a space where someone decided they did not belong. Tonight was about the message that would be sent if he simply accepted this treatment and walked away. He pressed the call button. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Nate? Is everything all right? Merry Christmas, brother. Ray, I'm at O'Hare. I need your help." Nathaniel kept his voice low, but in the silence that had fallen over the gate area, his words carried further than he intended. He explained the situation in brief, clinical terms. The accusation. The security response. The public humiliation. The refusal to verify his credentials through proper channels. On the other end of the line, Admiral Raymond Foster, now Vice Commander of the United States Transportation Command and one of the most powerful figures in American military logistics, listened without interruption. When Nathaniel finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Foster's voice came through, cold and hard as steel. "Stay on the line, Nate. This ends now." What happened next would later be described by witnesses as something out of a movie. Within 90 seconds, Derek Walsh's radio crackled to life. His face went pale as he listened, his hand unconsciously moving away from his weapon. Miguel Santos received a call on his personal cell phone, and his expression shifted from neutral to something approaching alarm. In rapid succession, the situation began to transform. A message came through to the airport's Central Security Office from the Department of Homeland Security Regional Headquarters. Another message arrived at Continental Airways Operations Center, flagged as highest priority. Phones began ringing throughout the terminal's administrative offices, each call carrying the same message: there had been a grave mistake, and it needed to be corrected immediately. Brittany Morrison watched the sudden activity with growing confusion. "What's happening? Who did he call?" No one answered her. The officers who had been so eager to search Nathaniel's belongings were now speaking in hushed, urgent tones, their body language completely changed. From the far end of the terminal, footsteps echoed against the polished floor. Fast footsteps, purposeful footsteps, the footsteps of people who were not accustomed to being kept waiting. A man in his 50s appeared first, his airport security badge identifying him as Thomas Bradley, Director of Security for Chicago O'Hare International Airport. Behind him came a woman in business attire, her Continental Airways lanyard marking her as someone of importance. And behind them, two men in dark suits whose bearings screamed federal authority louder than any badge could. The crowd parted like the Red Sea before Moses. Thomas Bradley strode directly to where Nathaniel stood surrounded by his scattered belongings, his face a mask of barely controlled fury. He looked at Derek Walsh with an expression that promised significant career consequences, then turned to Nathaniel with something approaching reverence. "Captain Brooks," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "please accept my deepest apologies on behalf of this airport. Do you have any idea who this man is?" He addressed the last question to Derek, who looked like he might be sick. "What do you think?" the security director said next. What truth about Nathaniel's identity was about to come out? Stay with me, because the revelation that follows will change everything you thought you knew about this story. Thomas Bradley turned to face the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "This man," he said, gesturing to Nathaniel, "is Captain Nathaniel Brooks. He is a recipient of the Distinguished Flying Cross, one of the highest honors awarded to military aviators. He served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq, flying missions that most of us cannot imagine." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Brittany Morrison's face had gone from smug satisfaction to pale disbelief, but Bradley was not finished. In 2008, Captain Brooks single-handedly saved a convoy of American soldiers from an enemy ambush. 23 lives, preserved because this man was willing to risk everything. Among those soldiers was Commander Raymond Foster, who is now Admiral Raymond Foster, Vice Commander of the United States Transportation Command. Bradley paused, letting the implications sink in. "The Admiral called me personally, 3 minutes ago, to inform me that one of his closest friends and a genuine American hero was being treated like a criminal in my airport." Rebecca Chen from Continental Airways stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. "I can confirm that Captain Brooks has been employed with our airline for 11 years. He holds the distinction of being named Pilot of the Year 3 consecutive times. His safety record is impeccable, with over 15,000 hours of flight time and 0 incidents. He is, quite frankly, one of the finest pilots in commercial aviation." The crowd's energy had shifted completely. Where moments ago there had been suspicion and fear, now there were murmurs of outrage directed not at Nathaniel but at his accusers. Phones that had been recording his humiliation were now capturing his vindication. Brittany Morrison took an involuntary step backward, her carefully constructed confidence crumbling like a sandcastle before the tide. I didn't know," she stammered. "He looked suspicious. I was just being careful. Anyone would have done the same thing." Thomas Bradley's gaze could have frozen the Great Lakes. "Suspicious how, exactly, Ms. Morrison?" "Because of his uniform? His credentials? Or was it something else about his appearance that led you to conclude he couldn't possibly be who he said he was?" The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. Everyone present knew exactly what that something else was, even if no one was willing to say it aloud. One of the men in dark suits stepped forward, his federal badge now visible. Agent Marcus Williams of the Department of Homeland Security was an imposing figure, standing well over 6 feet with shoulders that suggested he had not always worked behind a desk. His skin was dark, darker than Nathaniel's, and his eyes held the kind of weariness that came from dealing with situations like this far too often. "Ms. Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the formal cadence of official business, "making a false report about a security threat in an airport is a federal crime. The penalties can include up to 5 years in prison and fines up to $250,000. Brittany's composure shattered completely. "What? No, you can't be serious. I didn't make a false report. I genuinely believed he was an imposter. I was protecting people." "You accused a decorated military veteran and a licensed commercial pilot of being a criminal," Agent Williams continued, unmoved by her protests. "You did so publicly, with no evidence, and you explicitly identified him by race in your call to security. These actions have consequences." "Please," Brittany said, her voice breaking, "my father is Richard Morrison. He's a former state senator. He knows people. If you'll just let me call him, he can explain everything." Agent Williams' expression did not change. "Ma'am, I don't care if your father is the President of the United States. What I care about is that you terrorized an innocent man in front of hundreds of witnesses, and you did so on Christmas Eve while he was trying to get home to his family. Now, I'm going to need you to come with us." Through all of this, Nathaniel Brooks had remained silent, watching the scene unfold with an expression that was difficult to read. Relief, certainly. Vindication, perhaps. But also something deeper, something that looked almost like grief for the world his children would inherit. Thomas Bradley approached him quietly. "Captain Brooks, I cannot express how sorry I am that this happened. The officer who responded inappropriately will be disciplined. The airline will be issuing a formal apology. And if there's anything else we can do." Nathaniel held up a hand. "There is one thing. Before you take her away, I want to press charges. Every charge that applies." A murmur ran through the crowd. Brittany Morrison let out something between a sob and a scream. "You can't. It was a misunderstanding. I'll lose everything." Nathaniel turned to face her for the first time since the authorities had arrived. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which somehow made his words more devastating. "Not for revenge, Ms. Morrison. I've faced people like you my entire life. You are not special. You are not unique. You are simply the latest in a long line of people who looked at my skin and decided I couldn't possibly have earned my place." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried to every corner of the gate area. "I'm pressing charges because the next black man you accuse might not have an admiral to call. The next black pilot, or doctor, or lawyer, or teacher might not have the connections to prove their innocence before your assumptions destroy their career. Someone has to draw a line and say enough. Today, that someone is me." The silence that followed was profound. Then, slowly, someone in the crowd began to clap. A single person at first, then 2, then 10, until the applause spread through the terminal like wildfire. People who had been afraid to speak up earlier now called out words of support. "Tell it, Captain. We see you, brother." "That's right." Brittany Morrison was led away in handcuffs, her designer uniform disheveled, her makeup streaked with tears. She screamed about her father's connections until she was out of earshot, but no one was listening anymore. The story had already escaped into the digital ether, spreading across social media with the speed of righteous fury. By morning, the whole country would know what had happened at Gate B-17. The walk from Gate B-17 to the airport security offices was approximately 400 feet. For Brittany Morrison, it might as well have been 400 miles. Every step brought her past another cluster of travelers who had witnessed her downfall, another phone raised to capture her disgrace, another face twisted in contempt for what she had done. "You can't do this to me," she screamed, struggling against the grip of the agents flanking her. "Do you know who my father is? Do you have any idea what he's going to do to all of you?" Her voice echoed through the terminal, bouncing off the high ceilings and mixing with the incongruous sounds of Christmas music still playing over the speakers. It came upon a midnight clear, provided an almost surreal soundtrack to her public humiliation, the words about peace on earth forming a bitter counterpoint to the chaos unfolding below. Agent Williams maintained his professional composure, but his partner, a younger agent named Thompson, allowed himself a small shake of the head. They had seen this before, the disbelief of privilege confronted with consequence. The assumption that family name or social status would provide immunity from the law. It never ended well. The crowd had swelled considerably since the confrontation began. Word had spread through the terminal, and travelers from other gates had gathered to witness the spectacle. Some were openly hostile, shouting accusations at Brittany as she passed. Others simply watched in silence, their phones recording every moment for posterity. A few, mostly older white travelers, looked uncomfortable, perhaps recognizing something of themselves in Brittany's assumptions and finding the reflection unflattering. Near the massive Christmas tree that dominated the central atrium, a group of black travelers had gathered. They watched Brittany's perp walk with expressions ranging from vindication to sorrow to something that looked like exhaustion. This was not a new story for them. It was simply the latest chapter in a narrative that had been playing out across America for centuries. The only novelty was that this time, for once, there were consequences. Back at Gate B-17, Officer Derek Walsh was experiencing consequences of his own. Thomas Bradley stood before him, flanked by airport officials whose expressions suggested that Derek's career in airport security was effectively over. "Your badge," Bradley said, extending his hand. "And your weapon. You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation into your conduct." Derek's face had gone from pale to red to pale again over the course of the last 15 minutes. "Sir, I was just following protocol. The woman made a report, I responded appropriately." "Appropriately?" Bradley's voice rose for the first time. "You publicly searched the belongings of a decorated war hero based on nothing more than the word of a stranger who identified him primarily by his race. You made no attempt to verify his credentials through proper channels. You treated him like a suspect when he offered nothing but cooperation. Sir, with all due respect. There is no respect in what you did tonight, Officer Walsh. None. You didn't just fail this airport. You failed the uniform you wear and the values you swore to uphold." Bradley gestured to two other security personnel. "Escort him off the premises. He is not to access any airport facilities until the investigation is complete." Derek Walsh was led away without handcuffs but with something far more damaging, the knowledge that his actions would be scrutinized by investigators, lawyers, and likely the national media. His career, which had seemed so promising just an hour ago, now hung by the thinnest of threads. Miguel Santos watched his former partner go, then approached Nathaniel with something approaching shame in his eyes. "Captain Brooks, I want you to know that I argued for verification before things went this far. I should have argued harder. I should have stopped it." Nathaniel looked at the younger officer for a long moment. "You're right. You should have. But I appreciate you saying so. Remember this feeling the next time you're in a situation like this. Remember it and act on it. That's how things change." Meanwhile, 300 miles away in Atlanta, Richard Morrison's phone was ringing. The former state senator was in the middle of a Christmas Eve gathering at the home of a prominent developer, surrounded by the kind of people who measured their worth in political influence and real estate holdings. He excused himself to take the call, expecting perhaps an update on his daughter's travel delays. What he heard instead turned his blood to ice. "Daddy," Brittany sobbed through the phone, "they've arrested me. They're saying I committed a federal crime. You have to do something. You have to call someone." Richard Morrison was a man who had built his career on connections, on knowing the right people and leveraging those relationships when needed. Within minutes of ending the call with his daughter, he was working his contact list with the desperation of a man watching his family's reputation crumble in real time. But something had changed. The friends who usually answered on the first ring were letting calls go to voicemail. The favors he tried to call and were met with awkward silences and excuses about being out of town. Word had already spread through the networks of power that Richard Morrison's daughter had done something toxic, something that could contaminate anyone associated with her by proxy. One contact, a federal judge Richard had helped get appointed, spoke frankly. "Richard, I've seen the video. It's everywhere. Your daughter racially profiled a war hero on Christmas Eve, and she did it on camera. There's nothing I can do, and frankly, there's nothing I would do even if I could. This is the kind of thing that ends careers, and I'm not ending mine for this." The call ended with a click, and Richard Morrison stood alone in the marble foyer of his host's mansion, watching his family's carefully constructed world begin to collapse. His wife Victoria, who had joined him on the call, had to be helped to a chair when she saw the video. Her elegant composure, maintained through decades of society functions and carefully curated public appearances, cracked completely as she watched her daughter scream about their family name while being led away in handcuffs. Even Chad Morrison, the family's legal prodigy, refused to help. "I can't represent her, Dad. Even if I wanted to, it would be a conflict of interest since we're family. But more than that." He paused, struggling to find words. "What she did was wrong. It was racist and wrong, and I can't pretend otherwise. You raised her to think certain people didn't belong in certain places. This is the result." The accusation landed like a physical blow. Richard Morrison had never considered himself a racist. He had simply had opinions, preferences, observations about how the world worked. He had never burned a cross or used slurs in public. But watching the video of his daughter, hearing the contempt in her voice as she accused an innocent man of being an imposter, he could not deny where those attitudes had come from. Back at O'Hare, the video of Brittany's arrest had begun its viral journey. Posted first by a college student who had been waiting at a nearby gate, it hit Twitter at 9:47 p.m. Central Time. By 10:15, it had been shared over 100,000 times. By 10:45, it was trending nationally under multiple hashtags including Justice for Captain Brooks, Christmas Eve Racism, and Fly While Black. The comments section became a battleground and a support group simultaneously. Black pilots from around the world shared their own stories of being questioned, doubted, and humiliated. Flight attendants confessed to witnessing similar incidents that they had been too afraid to report. Veterans expressed outrage that a decorated service member had been treated like a criminal. And millions of ordinary people voiced their support for a man they had never met but whose dignity they had watched be attacked in real time. Continental Airways issued a statement within 2 hours, expressing full support for Captain Nathaniel Brooks and announcing an immediate review of all discrimination complaints filed by employees and passengers in the previous 5 years. Prestige Airlines, Brittany Morrison's employer, moved even faster, releasing a terse announcement that the individual in question is no longer employed by our organization before the clock struck midnight. The night that should have been silent and holy had become a reckoning. Nathaniel Brooks pulled into his driveway at 12:17 a.m. on Christmas morning. The snow had stopped falling, leaving a blanket of white that sparkled under the streetlights like scattered diamonds. The house before him was dark except for the warm glow of Christmas lights outlining the windows and the faint flicker of the tree visible through the living room curtains. He sat in the car for a long moment, engine idling, heat blasting against the cold that had seeped into his bones. The events of the past 5 hours played through his mind like a film he could not stop watching. The accusation. The search. The humiliation. The vindication. The endless questions from reporters who had materialized as if from thin air, all wanting to know how he felt, what he thought, what message he had for America. He had not answered their questions. He had simply gathered his scattered belongings, including Maya's handmade card that now bore the footprint of a careless security officer, and walked out of the airport without looking back. The police had offered an escort, but he had declined. He just wanted to go home. The front door opened before he could reach for his keys. Denise stood in the doorway, her robe wrapped tight against the cold, her face a mixture of relief and fury and love so fierce it took his breath away. She had been watching the news. She had seen everything. "Nate," she whispered, and then she was in his arms, and he was holding her, and the dam he had built around his emotions finally broke. He cried into her shoulder, great heaving sobs that came from somewhere so deep he had not known it existed. He cried for the humiliation he had endured, for the dignity he had fought to maintain, for all the times he had swallowed his anger and smiled through his pain and pretended that being treated as less than human was just part of the job. "I'm so proud of you," Denise said into his chest. "I'm so incredibly proud of you." They stood there in the doorway, the cold forgotten, until a small voice from inside the house broke the moment. "Daddy?" Maya stood at the top of the stairs in her Christmas pajamas, her hair in the braids Denise had done that morning, her eyes wide with the confusion of a child who did not understand why her parents were crying. Jerome Jr. appeared beside her moments later, rubbing sleep from his eyes, clutching the stuffed airplane Nathaniel had given him last Christmas. "Hey, baby girl," Nathaniel said, his voice rough but steady. "Hey, little man. Come here." They ran to him, their small bodies colliding with his legs, their arms wrapping around him with the desperate grip of children who had sensed something was wrong even in their sleep. He knelt down and pulled them both close, breathing in the scent of their shampoo and their innocence and their unconditional love. "Daddy, why are you crying?" Jerome Jr. asked. "Because I'm happy to be home, buddy. That's all. I'm just really happy to be home." They opened presents at 1:30 in the morning, an unprecedented breach of Brooks' family protocol that the children were too excited to question. Maya screamed with joy when she saw the princess doll, and Jerome Jr. immediately began racing his remote control car around the living room, narrowly avoiding the Christmas tree multiple times. Denise served hot chocolate with extra marshmallows, and for a few precious hours, the events at the airport faded into the background. But the world outside their walls was still turning, and by the time they woke on Christmas morning, the story had taken on a life of its own. Every major news network led with coverage of the incident. CNN had obtained extended footage from multiple angles, piecing together a comprehensive timeline of events. Fox News was running a panel discussion on political correctness and airport security, with guests arguing both sides of an argument that Nathaniel did not believe had two sides. MSNBC had tracked down several of Brittany Morrison's former colleagues, who provided anonymous quotes about her problematic attitudes and history of complaints. The internet had done what the internet does, transforming a single incident into a movement. The hashtag #WeKeepFlyingAnyway, inspired by Nathaniel's words to Maya during a phone interview he had briefly given, had become a rallying cry. Black professionals in every field were sharing their stories of being questioned, doubted, and dismissed. Pilots, doctors, lawyers, engineers, professors, they all had experiences that echoed Nathaniel's, and they were finally giving voice to indignities they had long suffered in silence. On December 26, the news coverage intensified. The governor of Illinois issued a statement condemning the racist attack on Captain Nathaniel Brooks and calling for a comprehensive review of anti-discrimination training in all state agencies. The CEO of Continental Airways appeared on morning television to announce a new initiative aimed at increasing diversity in commercial aviation. 3 separate civil rights organizations filed amicus briefs in support of federal charges against Brittany Morrison. Nathaniel declined every interview request except one. On December 28, he sat down with NBC's Lester Holt for a conversation that would be watched by more than 30 million people. The interview took place in Nathaniel's living room, with Denise and the children present at his request. He wanted America to see what Brittany Morrison had threatened, what her assumptions had nearly destroyed. A family. A home. A life built on sacrifice and service. Captain Brooks, Holt began, you've had a few days to process what happened. How are you feeling? Nathaniel considered the question carefully. Honestly, Lester, I'm feeling a lot of things. I'm angry, of course. Anyone would be. But I'm also sad. Sad that in 2023, a black man in a pilot's uniform is still treated as a suspect. Sad that my children have to grow up in a world where they'll face the same doubts and assumptions I've faced. You served 3 combat tours in Afghanistan and Iraq. You have the Distinguished Flying Cross. You've saved lives, both in military service and as a commercial pilot. Does it frustrate you that none of that seemed to matter at that moment? It's not frustrating, Lester. It's exhausting. Nathaniel's voice was steady but heavy. My father worked in an auto plant in Detroit for 30 years. He told me once that I would have to be twice as good to get half as far. I thought if I achieved enough, if I earned enough accolades, if I served my country well enough, I could escape that reality. But you can't escape it. You can't out-achieve prejudice. No matter how high you fly, there will always be someone waiting to pull you back down. Maya, who had been sitting quietly beside her mother, suddenly spoke up. Daddy, why did that lady think you were lying? The question, innocent and devastating, silenced the room. Nathaniel turned to his daughter, his expression softening. Because some people judge others by how they look, baby girl, not by who they are. They see the outside and think they know the inside. But they're wrong. That's not fair, Maya said. No, baby. It's not. But we keep flying anyway. That's what we do. We keep flying. The clip of that exchange would become the defining image of the story, shared millions of times, referenced in think pieces and editorials, cited in congressional testimony about racial profiling. Maya Brooks, at 8 years old, had articulated what generations of adults had struggled to express. That's not fair. 3 words that contained an entire history of injustice. The federal case against Brittany Morrison proceeded with unusual swiftness, driven by public attention and the overwhelming strength of the evidence. On March 15, after her lawyer's attempts to negotiate a plea deal had failed, she stood before Judge Catherine Okonkwo in the United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. The charges were read aloud in the hushed courtroom. Filing a false police report, making a false statement regarding a security threat, civil rights violations under Title 18, and hate crime enhancements that elevated the potential penalty significantly. If convicted on all counts, Brittany faced up to 15 years in federal prison. She had changed dramatically in the 3 months since her arrest. Gone was the polished confidence, the designer clothes, the perfectly styled hair. The woman who stood before the judge looked diminished, hollowed out by the consequences of her actions. Her attorney, a high-priced specialist in white-collar defense, had advised her to express remorse, but the words that came out sounded rehearsed and hollow. The prosecution called witnesses who painted a damning picture. Fellow flight attendants testified to Brittany's history of discriminatory comments. Former college roommates described her family's casual racism, the dinner table conversations about certain people knowing their place. Airport security footage captured every moment of her confrontation with Nathaniel, her face contorted with contempt as she demanded he be treated as a threat. Nathaniel was called to testify, and for the first time since the incident, he came face to face with the woman who had tried to destroy him. She could not meet his eyes. "Captain Brooks," the prosecutor asked, "can you describe the impact of Ms. Morrison's accusations on your life?" Nathaniel spoke slowly, choosing his words with care. "On the surface, things have improved for me. I've received support from around the world. I've been given platforms to speak about racial profiling in aviation. My employer has been exceptional in their backing." He paused, and when he continued, his voice was quieter. "But underneath that, the damage is real. My daughter asks me now, every time I go to work, whether someone is going to accuse me of lying again. My son had nightmares for weeks after he saw the video, saw his father being treated like a criminal. My wife worries every time I leave the house in uniform. That fear, that uncertainty, that's what Ms. Morrison's actions cost my family. That's what racism costs. Not just moments of humiliation, but years of anxiety that never fully goes away." The trial lasted 4 days. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned with guilty verdicts on all counts, there was no celebration in the courtroom, only a grim acknowledgement that justice, delayed so often, had finally arrived. Judge Okonkwo scheduled sentencing for June. In the meantime, Brittany Morrison was remanded to federal custody, her bail revoked after prosecutors argued she posed a flight risk given her family's resources. The Morrison family's collapse was now complete. Richard Morrison had resigned from all his board positions, his political connections having evaporated like morning dew. The real estate company that bore his name had filed for bankruptcy after major clients terminated their contracts, unwilling to be associated with the family's disgrace. Victoria Morrison had checked into a facility for treatment of severe anxiety and depression, leaving their mansion in Buckhead empty except for a skeleton staff. Chad Morrison, the youngest member of the family, had taken a different path. In a lengthy essay published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, he publicly disavowed his family's racism and committed to pro bono work with civil rights organizations. "I was raised to believe certain myths about certain people," he wrote. "I was taught to see difference as deficiency. It took watching my sister's hatred exposed to the world to see my own complicity in a system of prejudice that stretches back generations. I cannot undo what was done, but I can dedicate myself to ensuring it is not repeated." For Nathaniel, the months following the incident brought unexpected opportunities and profound challenges. The scholarship fund established in his name had already awarded 50 grants to aspiring pilots from underrepresented communities. He had testified before Congress about racial profiling in aviation, his words prompting new FAA guidelines on discrimination training. Continental Airways had promoted him to chief pilot for their Chicago hub, making him responsible for training and standards for over 200 pilots. But fame, even positive fame, exacted its costs. He could no longer walk through an airport without being recognized. People approached him constantly, sometimes with gratitude, sometimes with their own stories of discrimination, sometimes with the uncomfortable adulation that treated him as a symbol rather than a person. He was invited to events and galas and conferences, asked to give speeches and accept awards and appear on television. Each invitation was another demand on time he would rather spend with his family. One evening in late May, Nathaniel sat on his back porch watching the sun set over the Chicago suburbs. Denise joined him, carrying 2 glasses of lemonade, and they sat together in comfortable silence. "You've seemed distant lately," Denise finally said. "Where does your mind go?" Nathaniel sipped his lemonade, considering the question. "I keep thinking about what happens next. Not for me, for us, but for everyone. This story, my story, it got attention because I had connections, because I could make one phone call and have an admiral vouch for me. But what about the next person? What about the black pilot who doesn't know any admirals? What about the black doctor or lawyer or teacher who gets accused and has no one to call?" Denise took his hand. "You can't save everyone, Nate. I know. But I keep wondering if anything really changes, or if we just have moments where everyone pays attention and says the right things, and then the world goes back to exactly the way it was." A letter had arrived that afternoon, forwarded by his lawyers. It was from Brittany Morrison, written from her cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Chicago. Nathaniel had not opened it for hours, unsure whether he wanted to read whatever excuses or apologies it contained. Now, with Denise beside him, he tore open the envelope. The letter was handwritten, 3 pages long, the penmanship shaky in places. Brittany did not ask for forgiveness. She did not make excuses or blame others. Instead, she wrote about growing up in a household where prejudice was as natural as breathing, where certain assumptions were so ingrained that questioning them never occurred to her. She wrote about sitting in her cell with nothing but time, watching the video of her confrontation with Nathaniel over and over, seeing for the first time the ugliness in her own face. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she concluded. "I'm not sure I would forgive me. But I wanted you to know that what happened that night changed me. Not the arrest, not the trial, not the prison sentence. What changed me was seeing myself the way the rest of the world saw me. I was a monster, and I didn't even know it. Now I know. I will spend the rest of my life trying to become someone else." Nathaniel read the letter twice, then handed it to Denise. She read it in silence, tears forming in her eyes. "Will you write back?" she asked. Nathaniel shook his head slowly. "Some things can't be fixed with words. If she's really changed, she'll show it through her actions, not her letters. And if she hasn't?" He shrugged. "Then nothing I say will matter anyway." He folded the letter and tucked it into his pocket. It would go into a drawer with the other artifacts of this strange chapter of his life, the newspaper clippings, the photographs, the thank-you notes from strangers. Evidence that something had happened, that something had mattered, that for one brief moment, justice had prevailed. But the sun was setting, and his children were inside, and tomorrow he had a flight to Denver. The world kept turning, and Captain Nathaniel Brooks had work to do. 6 months after that Christmas Eve, Brittany Morrison stood before Judge Okonkwo to receive her sentence. The courtroom was packed with media, activists, and ordinary citizens who had followed the case from its viral beginnings to this final chapter. Richard and Victoria Morrison sat in the gallery, aged beyond recognition by the weight of their family's disgrace. Nathaniel Brooks was not present, having submitted a victim impact statement but declined to attend the sentencing. Judge Okonkwo, a 58-year-old black woman who had spent 30 years navigating systems that often worked against people who looked like her, addressed the defendant with neither anger nor sympathy. "Ms. Morrison, you have been found guilty of serious federal crimes. But more than that, you have been found guilty of a kind of moral blindness that this country has struggled with since its founding. You looked at a man who had served his nation with distinction, who had earned every accolade through sweat and sacrifice, and you saw only the color of his skin. You saw a threat where there was heroism. You saw deception where there was integrity. You saw someone who did not belong when, in truth, it was your prejudice that had no place in that airport. She paused, shuffling papers before her. The federal sentencing guidelines suggest a range of 3 to 5 years for offenses of this nature. However, given the egregious circumstances, the public humiliation deliberately inflicted on the victim, and the broader message that must be sent about the consequences of racial profiling, the court sentences you to 4 years in federal prison. Brittany's shoulders shook with silent sobs. Her parents clutched each other in the gallery. The reporters' keyboards clattered with the urgency of breaking news. Additionally, Judge Okonkwo continued, upon release, you will complete 500 hours of community service with organizations serving communities of color. You will be prohibited from working in aviation or any travel-related industry for 10 years. And you will be required to attend and complete a certified program in racial bias awareness. The gavel fell. Brittany Morrison was led away in handcuffs for the second time in 6 months, this time to begin a sentence that would define the rest of her life. Outside the courthouse, cameras captured the reactions. Civil rights leaders praised the sentence as a step toward accountability. Critics argued it was too harsh or too lenient, depending on their perspective. Social media erupted with opinions and arguments, the discourse as divided as the nation itself. But somewhere in the sky over Nebraska, Captain Nathaniel Brooks was focused on something else entirely. He was in the cockpit of Continental Flight 1247, bound from Chicago to Atlanta. The weather was clear, the instruments steady, the kind of routine flight that allowed the mind to wander. He thought about the sentencing, which his co-pilot had mentioned during their pre-flight briefing. He thought about Brittany Morrison beginning her years of confinement. He thought about whether any of it would change anything, really. Then a voice from the right seat interrupted his contemplation. Captain Brooks, can I tell you something? He turned to look at his co-pilot, a young black woman named Jasmine Turner who had joined Continental just 8 months ago. She was 27 years old, with natural hair pulled back in a professional style and eyes that held a mixture of nervousness and determination. Of course, First Officer Turner. What's on your mind? Jasmine took a breath. Sir, I need you to know something. I applied to flight school because of you. Nathaniel's eyebrows rose. Because of what happened at the airport? Yes, sir. I saw your interview, the one where your daughter asked why that woman thought you were lying. And you said we keep flying anyway. Jasmine's voice wavered slightly but did not break. I was working at a coffee shop in Memphis when I saw that. I had dreamed about flying since I was a little girl, but I never thought it was for people like me. I never saw anyone who looked like me in the cockpit. I had almost given up on the dream entirely. What changed? Nathaniel asked quietly. You did, sir. You showed me that it was possible. That people like us could reach the highest levels of this profession. That no matter how many people tried to pull us down, we could keep flying anyway. She reached into her flight bag and produced an envelope. My grandmother wanted me to give you this. She said you'd understand. Nathaniel took the envelope, his curiosity piqued. Inside was a photograph, old and slightly faded, printed in black and white. It showed a young black woman standing beside a small propeller aircraft, her smile radiant with pride and defiance. On the back, in elegant handwriting, were the words, Bessie Coleman inspired me. Now, Nathaniel Brooks inspires my granddaughter. Bessie Coleman. The first black woman to earn a pilot's license, back in 1921. The woman who had to travel to France to learn to fly because no American school would accept her. The woman who had died too young but whose legacy had inspired generations of black aviators. Nathaniel stared at the photograph for a long moment. The connection stretched across a century, from Bessie Coleman to Jasmine's grandmother to Jasmine herself to the cockpit of this commercial airliner flying over the heartland of America. A chain of inspiration, unbroken despite everything that had tried to shatter it. Do you know what your grandmother just taught me? He said finally. What's that, sir? That one person standing up isn't just about that moment. It's about every moment that comes after. Every person who sees and believes they can too. He placed the photograph on the instrument panel where he could see it. Let's fly, First Officer Turner. Yes, sir, Captain. The aircraft continued its journey through clear skies, two black pilots in the cockpit of a commercial airliner, carrying 163 passengers who had no idea of the history being made above their heads. Somewhere below, Brittany Morrison was beginning her sentence. Somewhere below, Derek Walsh was working a security job at a shopping mall, his career in aviation permanently over. Somewhere below, a little girl named Maya Brooks was telling her classmates that her daddy was a superhero who flew through the clouds. And somewhere in the cosmic ledger where justice is tallied, a balance had shifted, if only slightly, toward the side of righteousness. This Christmas Eve began with an accusation meant to ground a pilot because of the color of his skin. Instead, it launched a movement that lifted countless others into the sky. Because sometimes, the very thing designed to break you becomes the thing that elevates everyone else. Captain Nathaniel Brooks did not just prove he could fly. He proved that no amount of hatred, no depth of prejudice, no legacy of discrimination can keep a dream from soaring. To everyone who watched this story unfold, I want to ask you something before we end. What would you have done in Nathaniel's place? Would you have pressed charges, or would you have walked away? Comment below with your thoughts, and let's have a real conversation about how we can all work toward a world where stories like this become history rather than headlines. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss stories of courage, justice, and the triumph of human dignity. Your support helps us bring more stories like Captain Brooks to the world. Thank you for watching, thank you for caring, and thank you for being part of a community that believes in standing up for what's right. May you always have the courage to keep flying, no matter what storms try to ground you. Until next time, stay strong, stay hopeful, and remember, the sky has no ceiling for those who refuse to stop climbing. This story teaches us something powerful about the cost of assumptions and the strength required to stand firm in your truth. Captain Nathaniel Brooks spent 18 years proving himself in the skies, served his country with distinction, and earned every stripe on his uniform through sacrifice and dedication. Yet none of that mattered to someone who had already decided what he could or could not be based solely on the color of his skin. The lesson here is twofold. First, prejudice blinds us to the humanity of others. Brittany Morrison looked at a decorated war hero and saw only a threat because her mind could not reconcile excellence with blackness. Her assumptions cost her everything, her career, her freedom, her family's reputation. The beliefs she inherited became the chains that bound her. Second, dignity is not something others can take from you. Nathaniel remained calm when every fiber of his being must have screamed for anger. He chose to fight with truth rather than rage, and that choice transformed a moment of humiliation into a movement of inspiration. We must ask ourselves difficult questions. What assumptions do we carry? What excellence do we fail to see because of our own blindness? The sky belongs to everyone who earns their wings. No one has the right to ground another person's dreams based on prejudice. Change begins when we choose to see people as they are, not as our fears imagine them to be. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever been judged unfairly before people knew the real you? Have you witnessed someone being treated differently because of how they looked? Drop your story in the comments below, because your voice matters and your experience could help someone else feel less alone. If Captain Brooks' courage inspired you tonight, smash that like button and let the algorithm know this story deserves to be seen. Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss powerful stories like this one. And please, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that standing up for yourself is always worth it. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for believing that justice matters. May you always have the strength to keep flying no matter who tries to ground you. May your truth be your wings and your integrity your compass. Until next time, stay brave, stay kind, and remember that the sky has no limits for those who refuse to stop climbing.